over $35 trillion. That's the latest number for the U.S. national debt.
It's staggering, isn't it? As of May 2025, that's like 120% of the entire U.S. economy's output for a year.
Right. And you might be sitting there thinking, okay, huge number, but why does it really matter to me?
Well, it matters a lot. It really shapes our financial future. The choices we have as a country limits our options.
Exactly. Which brings us to this, well, kind of controversial idea. There were reports, that it was floated within the Trump administration.
The idea of using inflation deliberately.
Yeah. Could we actually use inflation intentionally to sort of shrink this massive debt?
It's definitely a high-stakes thought. The basic idea, people call it inflating away debt, is pretty simple at its core. Rising prices just make the real value of fixed debt smaller.
Okay, walk me through that. Like, say you take out a $100 loan.
Right.
If everything suddenly costs twice as much later on,
Yeah, if inflation doubles prices.
then that $100 you still owe, it just doesn't feel as heavy because the dollars you pay it back with by, well, half as much.
Exactly. Now, scale that idea up to trillions in government bonds.
You can see the, let's say, theoretical appeal. So beyond just making the debt number look smaller relative to the economy, were there other potential upsides they might have seen, maybe linked to specific economic conditions?
That's a good point. It's not just about the debt figure itself. Proponents might argue it could kickstart the economy. Inflation often goes hand in hand with higher demand, more spending.
Okay.
And, if wages keep pace, maybe people feel a bit better off, can handle their own debts more easily.
But that sounds like a big if. Managing inflation carefully.
Oh, absolutely. That's the massive challenge. It's not easy to control.
Okay. So most U.S. debt, it's in these fixed-rate treasury bonds. Inflation goes up. The real value of what the government has to pay back goes down.
Precisely. And the source material we looked at highlights another key thing, how inflation affects the bigger economic picture.
You mean GDP?
Yeah. Inflation tends to boost nominal GDP. Prices are up, incomes are generally rising too, so the total dollar value of the economy inflates.
So even if the debt number stays the same in dollars,
It shrinks relative to the size of the economy. That debt-to-GDP ratio, which everyone watches, it goes down. Makes the country look, well, more fiscally sound on paper.
right. And this is where it gets really counterintuitive for me. You'd think, okay, higher inflation means the government immediately has to pay more interest to borrow, right?
You would think so,
Yeah.
but not always, or at least not always right away.
How does that work?
It comes down to the real interest rate. That's basically the nominal rate, the sticker price on the bond, minus the inflation rate.
Okay.
So if inflation shoots up faster than the interest rates the government is paying on its debt.
The actual cost of borrowing in real terms could fall?
Exactly. For a while, anyway. Especially if, say, the Federal Reserve is keeping its official rates low, or if bond markets are slow to react, maybe they don't believe the inflation will last.
So the analysis we read suggests this wouldn't just be hoping for inflation, but actively engineering it, using policy. First up, messing with monetary policy.
Yeah, coordination is the term used, basically putting pressure on the Fed.
How? Public statements? Appointments?
Could be both. Publicly calling for lower rates, even if inflation is ticking up. Appointing Fed governors who are, shall we say, more inclined towards looser policy.
And encouraging more quantitative easing,
Right.
QE.
Right. That's when the Fed buys assets, like government bonds, injecting cash into the system. It pushes down longer-term rates and increases the money supply, potentially inflationary.
But meddling with the Fed, that's risky, undermines their independence.
Hugely risky. Central bank independence is considered pretty vital for stable prices. Messing with that can really damage credibility long-term.
Right.
We've seen historical examples where that didn't end well.
Okay. Element 2, fiscal policy. Spending and taxes. Sounds like just opening the taps.
Pretty much. The idea is big government spending. Think massive infrastructure projects, maybe expanding social programs, injecting cash directly.
Driving up demand.
Exactly. And at the same time, maybe extending tax cuts or even making them bigger. Give people and businesses more money to spend. Again, more demand, potentially pushing prices up.
So money policy pushing, fiscal policy pulling. Then there's trade and supply side stuff. Tariffs.
This is interesting. Proposing broad tariffs, maybe 10%, 20% on imports.
That would make imports more expensive, obviously.
Directly, yes. And since we import a lot, that feeds straight into consumer prices. Plus, it shields domestic companies from competition. Maybe they raise their prices too.
And deregulation, how does that fit?
The source suggests deregulating energy, manufacturing. The stated goal might be boosting production, But the analysis hints it could actually cause supply bottlenecks,
Hmm.
disruptions, which also adds to inflation.
Okay, wow. Then there's trying to boost wages, wage push inflation.
Yeah, the thinking goes, support policies that tighten the labor market. Immigration restrictions were mentioned as one example.
Less labor supply means employers have to pay more.
Potentially, yes. Higher wages are good for workers, of course, but businesses often pass those higher labor costs onto consumers, higher prices again.
And the last piece is the spin, the communication strategy. You can't just say, we're making everything cost more.
Absolutely not. So the strategy would be to frame it. Say, look, this inflation is a necessary evil for stronger growth, more jobs.
Blame it on something else?
Exactly. Blame global supply chains, blame other countries, whatever. Deflect from the idea that it's a deliberate policy choice.
Okay, so that's the theoretical playbook. But the risks, they sound enormous.
They are
Yeah.
huge. First off, the bond market isn't stupid. If investors think high inflation is sticking around, they'll demand much higher interest rates on government debt.
So borrowing costs could actually shoot up, defeating part of the purpose.
Precisely. And then there's the damage to the actual economy. High inflation eats away at people's savings, their purchasing power.
Especially hitting people on fixed incomes or lower wages.
Disproportionately, yes. That erodes confidence. It can cause real hardship, maybe even social unrest.
And we mentioned the Fed's credibility already.
Critical. If the Fed is seen as bowing to political pressure, its power to manage the economy effectively is weakened. That's bad for everyone long term.
Plus, the tariffs could backfire. Trade wars.
A very real risk. Retaliation from other countries, hurting our exports, maybe raising import costs even more, just general global instability.
And the absolute worst case, hyperinflation.
The nightmare scenario,
Yeah?
where inflation spirals completely out of control. Think Weimar Germany, Venezuela, destroys economies, a very, very dangerous path to even contemplate.
Okay, so turning to the Trump administration specifically, the analysis suggests some of their actions or proposed actions sort of fit this mold, even if not explicitly planned that way.
That's the argument made, yeah. The tariffs they imposed and the talk of even broader ones like 10, 20%, that definitely pushes up prices.
Tax cuts, too, adding to the deficit, potentially boosting demand.
Yes, the tax cuts add to the debt and could fuel demand. Deregulation efforts, especially if they disrupted supply chains, could also play a role.
And the public pressure on the Fed for lower rates.
That fits the monetary policy coordination piece we discussed. Lots of public criticism aimed at the Fed chairman.
But crucially, the analysis doubts this was some, coherent secret master plan to inflate the debt away.
Exactly. It points to the implementation, especially with tariffs being quite chaotic, lots of changes, exemptions. It didn't look like a carefully calibrated long-term strategy. Seemed more driven by short-term political goals, maybe?
Right, not necessarily a deliberate, thought-out economic maneuver for debt reduction via inflation.
That's the assessment in the source, yes. The pieces might look like they fit, but the coordination and intent seemed lacking.
So, given all that the risks, the potential for chaos, the political realities, what does the source say about the chances of this actually working? Successfully inflating away the debt?
Not good. The estimate mentioned is low, maybe 20–30% chance of success.
Why so pessimistic?
Several reasons listed. The likely chaotic execution we just talked about, the real danger of markets reacting badly, bond yields spiking.
Political pushback, too. People don't like high inflation.
Voters really don't. Plus, potential global backlash from tariffs, supply chain issues worsening things, and crucially, the expectation that the Fed would likely resist strongly. They're mandated to control inflation.
And historically, has this ever worked?
The analysis mentions it has, in very specific circumstances,
Mhm.
like the U.S. after World War II. Massive debt, but also a very different global setup, more controls, less independent central banks.
Much harder now. Globalization, independent central
But
bank.
way harder. The world's just too interconnected, and central banks guard their independence much more fiercely now. Makes it far riskier, far less likely to succeed without major blowback.
Okay, so bringing this all together, we've looked at this, frankly, kind of radical idea, using inflation on purpose to tackle the huge U.S. debt.
Yeah.
And while making old debts feel smaller, sounds tempting on the surface.
Uh-huh.
The analysis we dove into paints a picture filled with really serious dangers. Higher borrowing costs eventually, economic chaos, loss of faith in institutions like the Fed, global fights.
And the specter of hyperinflation, however remote.
Right. And the source suggests Any recent moves that might look like this strategy were probably too fragmented, too chaotic to actually achieve that goal without causing significant economic pain.
Exactly. The theory might seem neat, but the practice looks, well, potentially disastrous.
So it leaves a big question for you listening. If deliberately inflating the debt away is so risky, maybe even unworkable, what are the sustainable long-term ways to deal with this national debt? What trade-offs are involved, and what different approaches do we need to be considering as we look at this really monumental challenge?